On a quiet evening in Pascagoula, Mississippi, a town known for its tranquility and peaceful riverbanks, two fishermen set out for a simple fishing trip, unaware that this would turn into one of the most unusual nights of their life. Against the serene backdrop of a gently flowing river, a pier, aged and worn by years of use, stretches out into the water. Here, two good friends and seasoned fishermen had set themselves up side by side. That evening, the darkness was pervasive, broken only by sparse pinpricks of the stars above and a warmly, dimly lit lantern. Seated with their legs dangling over the edge, they cast their lines into the water. On the shoreline, the tree stood tall, leaving the men quite isolated at that time, though they could still see a soft glow of the town in the distance. Other than the creaking of the pier, the night was peaceful, but the quiet would not last. Before proceeding, YouTube indicates that approximately only 38% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy the content and haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so as it helps me an awful lot. On the 11th of October 1973, two fishermen, 19-year-old Calvin Parker and 40-year-old Charlie Hickson, planned their impromptu fishing trip. The pair were both shipyard workers and had just finished their day alongside the rest of America at around 5 PM. They headed over to Charlie's place to gear up for their late night fishing endeavour. Charlie knew of this particular spot and said it was a great place to fish because grain would sometimes be unloaded in that area and usually some of it would spill into the water, attracting the fish. Before heading to their area of choice, they first wanted to try a nearby pier and they arrived at this first location at 6 PM and shared a drink together. It was dark, but they were lucky enough to have had a full moon that night, meaning that they had enough light to be able to see well enough. They fished there for just shy of an hour, casting their lines and recasting every so often, but they didn't get a single bite while they were on that pier. They thought about moving and settling down at the earlier mentioned spot, but first, Charlie wanted to give the fish another 5 minutes, which in hindsight was a mistake, though there was no way of knowing that at the time. From Calvin's peripheral vision, he noticed blue lights flashing in the direction of his car. They weren't technically supposed to be fishing on that pier, as it belonged to an abandoned shipyard, and they were preparing themselves to be moved by the police. They shared a word together and continued fishing, but were startled when an odd buzzing noise and vibration sensation filled the air around them. They both paused, fishing rods still in hand, before shooting up to their feet, not understanding what was happening. Then, they noticed that on the horizon was something of an oval shape, flashing a hazy blue, and approaching with unpredictable movements before becoming stationary around 2 feet over the ground, beyond the car and just before the pier. Calvin said that this sight sent chills down his spine, and Charlie went really pale just standing there next to him in silence. This made it worse for Calvin because Charlie was one of the bravest men he knew. Earlier in life, Charlie was a constable with the police force around the time he became friends with Calvin's family, and then later over time they all became close family friends. He once saved a young Calvin when he slipped and fell into a river while fishing. Charlie was said to have had no hesitations when he jumped straight in after him. The following is an account given by Charlie, though paraphrased somewhat to flow smoothly, and I've interjected with some comments from Calvin. We didn't know what to do, we had the river behind us, and that out there not knowing what it was. Before we had time to do anything, it seemed like it was opening and the flashing lights stopped. Once fully opened, there was a blinding light from the inside. We could see them in the opening. It looked like 3 people appeared and their silhouettes were distinct. I kind of thought that it was just people at first, but then they began their descent and were right in front of me almost instantly. It was the biggest shock I've ever had in my life. Calvin stated that he thought about running in those moments, but recounting later said that there just wasn't any time for that. They were shorter than me, I'd say about 5'2" or 3. They didn't have a neck, and their heads seemed to come directly to their shoulders. They had something that came to a point about where the nose would be, and each side where the ears would be. Calvin added to this description, stating that whatever these things were, they didn't appear to have any feet, and agreeing with Charlie's sentiments, stating that their heads were featureless outside of the points. It seemed to me that when they came out of that opening, they almost instantly were right there on us. They interlocked their arms with ours, and all together we just seemed to lift up off the ground and towards the opening of the oval. I didn't see any tables or chairs or anything in there, but the light was blinding and I could barely see anything. They carried me inside and placed me on something, some surface, and laid me back at an angle. There was this floating circle that looked like an eye. I'm not sure what it actually was, but that's what it looked like. It looked me right in the eye before moving over my entire body. Shortly thereafter, Charlie was unable to recall what took place next, stating only that the same way they were transported up, they were transported back to the ground. He said that as he was put back down to the ground, his legs gave way and he fell. But Calvin, on the other hand, was stood upright with his arms outstretched for some reason, staring towards the sky in the direction they'd just come from. Interestingly, Calvin's experience was similar to this, though it differed ever so slightly. Like Charlie, he said that he was taken to a small-sized room and placed on a table at around a 16 to 45 degree angle. He said that the room was very bright and he believed that he was roughly in the centre of it. He described that this thing that had brought him up to the oval and onto this table then left. There was a silence for a moment before he started hearing a clicking noise. Above him, he said, was a blue-looking square box about the size of a deck of cards that went around him 4 times, clicking. Later, he would conclude that he was being examined in a manner that perhaps isn't quite so obvious to us. Once that was over, another person, or being I suppose, entered the room that he believed was female. He likened the earlier beings to something akin to machines with jerky movements, while this one seemed to be more organic in some sense. He said that she had hands similar to ours, but the 2 middle fingers were longer than our own. He said that she pinched him by the cheek as if to show comfort. However, he wasn't able to move and said that he didn't perceive a sense of touch from her. Then, according to Calvin, she used her longer fingers to swab his throat, but mentally had told him that she didn't mean him any harm. At this point, he believed that he was given another or the same substance as before for a second time, before the more mechanical looking thing brought him back down to the riverbank. Calvin stated that he remembered touching back down to the ground with his arms extended outwards, but dropped them as Charlie began asking if he was okay. I was just amazed about where the light was coming from. I was scared and I couldn't move for some reason, and found out later that we'd been made to take some kind of substance. They realised that at the hospital. On the ground, they both stated that they felt weak and weren't sure for how long they remained sat down, but felt that it was around an hour. Calvin expressed that he didn't want anyone to know about this, and initially Charlie agreed. However, when they reached the car, the window was broken, and Calvin was having a hard time getting it to run, though it did start after a number of tries. As they began to drive towards Charlie's home, Charlie had a change of heart and told Calvin that he felt that he needed to tell someone about this, and that he wanted to pull over near the Mississippi Press building. Calvin argued the point and said that this isn't something he wanted, and Charlie said that he'd just tell them that Calvin had passed out so he could feign ignorance and say that he didn't really remember. Charlie may have been in a state of confusion or disorientation at the time because it was quite late and there was no one inside the building then. After he figured that out, instead of going home at that point, Charlie wanted to talk more about what had happened, so they went over to a local bar. It was at this place that, against Calvin's wishes, Charlie called the sheriff's department and reported what had happened to them. A Captain Glenn Ryder of the Jackson County Sheriff's Office came to them and picked them up and then took them to the station. This is where things take a turn and get weird in the eyes of the officers. This is what Glenn had to say. We took them down to the station and put them in a room with a voice-activated microphone concealed in the desk to see what they'd say. Myself and the other investigator got up and left to let them talk, to see if they would say something along the lines of, "Well, we got them fooled." They didn't. They were really concerned. The boy kept telling Charles, "Don't talk to them, those people are going to come back and get us." Here's a part of the audio recording.
Jesus Christ. I'm so damn bad about it, everybody please. That's what I thought. I had been through enough of hell on this earth, and now I have to go through something like this. But they could have, I guess they could have harmed us, son. They could have done anything to us if they didn't hurt me.
After reviewing the tape and separating the two men, the officer's skepticism seemed to diminish somewhat. Their demeanour shifted from dismissive to something more contemplative regarding the fisherman's account. Calvin had hoped to keep the incident confidential, but word travelled faster than he could have anticipated. In an almost ironic twist, the story gained so much traction that the first report I came across at the time of the incident was published by The Guardian, a newspaper a world away in London. Despite the widespread publicity, Charlie Hickson shared his fears with the Shreveport Journal in Louisiana. "I'll be the laughingstock of the country if I tell you what I've seen," says Hickson doggedly. "One of these days, folks will know that I was telling the truth. It may be too late then." With that account, we reach a close to the story of the actual incident itself. The debate that ensued was a familiar tussle between people who believed the story in its entirety and the people who didn't believe it one bit, which has already been well documented. Rather than retracing those steps, I've chosen to pivot and taken a different perspective to view the incident in a new light. My attention was captured by Preston C. Copeland's thesis for his Master of Science in American Studies at Utah State University. What interested me was not so much his retelling of the event, but his analysis of how such modern encounters may parallel the folklore of old. I've quoted and paraphrased the following from his paper. "I've always found it fascinating how somebody could experience something largely indefinable and have their worldview change forever. Throughout time, ideas of inherently inhuman beings have been used to explain perversive or other frightening occurrences. Being taken in this manner, whether by the fairies or something of a similar description that falls within that group, is a common staple in many parts of the world. The idea of being taken by fairies, for example, is described throughout Western European folklore. A changeling was the offspring of a fairy or some other entity that was put in place of a normal human child. It's fascinating to note that in modern times, fairies, or the fae as we'll refer to them, are often cast in a whimsical, silly and benign light. Yet this is a stark departure from the narratives of old. Throughout much of our past, vast swathes of folklore is littered with stark warnings about the fae. These warnings paint them not as playful and harmless, but rather as entities that are to be avoided at all cost. These tales urge caution while out in forest areas, by boulders, bodies of water, or just remote areas in general. Our ancestors portrayed them as deceptive at best and outright malevolent at their worst, intent on trickery and harm. They also convey a clear message, which states that being out alone in these places is not a good idea. The common depiction of the fae in stories for young people represents a distortion of what was once a serious and even sinister folklore tradition. The fae of the past were feared as dangerous and powerful beings who were sometimes friendly to humans, but could also usually be cruel and mischievous. Most of us think of the fae as tiny creatures flitting about on gossamer wings, waving a magic wand, but the past and folklore tell a different tale. When belief in the fae was common, most people feared them, and didn't like to mention them by name, and so referred to them by other names, the little people or the hidden people. Talk of the little people or the hidden people is something that does, and certainly did in the past, span every continent. The Europeans dubbed them fairies, elves, goblins, dwarfs, gnomes and so on, but again, we'll simplify the matter and refer to them as the fair. In the Middle East, you find mention of the jinn, which hold many similarities. The natives of Malaysia, often referred to as the Orang Asli, speak of the Orang Bunyan, which directly translates to the hidden people. And in Latin America, you find mention of the duende, which again is said to be something that hides in plain sight and takes people from forest areas. Now, let's delve into some detail and uncover why this is so captivating, while also relating it in some way to Calvin and Charlie's story. There was an incident that was reported in the 17th century involving Anne Jeffreys from England. Born in 1626 and living until 1698, Anne's life would later come to be marked by the extraordinary. Prior to her passing at the age of 72, she and the Pitt family were embroiled in a series of strange occurrences that centred around hair. These events were chronicled by Mr. M. Pitt, who detailed them in a letter seeking counsel from Dr. Edward Fowler, the then Bishop of Gloucestershire. In 1645, when Anne was 19 years old, is where this story really begins. Anne came from quite a poor background and managed to find employment working for the Pitt family, who were quite wealthy. She would maintain their estate home. It wasn't made clear in what year this occurred, but after finishing her morning duties one day, she sat in the Pitt's garden inside their arbour. While there, she would later relay that she heard someone moving past branches and was heading in her direction. She ignored it, thinking that it was just one of the family members, but she was taken aback when she heard what she described as a peculiar ringing coming from every direction, which is somewhat reminiscent of Calvin and Charles' description. In her account, she said that she felt afraid but didn't think that anyone would do her harm on such a bright day, where people would have been able to hear and would have quickly noticed and seen what was going on. She went on and said that during the ringing, 6 small men dressed in green appeared nearby. She said that they were charming and had big eyes. She later believed that they were of the fair. She went on and described that her environment had changed completely and that she had been paralysed and couldn't move. They took her, and I quote, into a castle in the sky, which also sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? Just without an understanding of the kind of sophisticated technology that exists today. I can't share in depth what she said happened next, but just think about the birds and the bees and use your own imagination. Now, what was quite interesting is that Anne did actually go missing on the day in question, and the Pitt family reported that they couldn't locate her on the estate grounds, though it was later stated that she was found wandering around in a disoriented fashion in the back garden. Anne stayed quiet about her ordeal for a time, though it wasn't specified how long. But she said that these little people would become her tormentors as they would just appear without making their presence known, and she said that they scared her. These experiences continued over time before she confided in one of the Pitt family members, which was about the worst possible decision she could have made, because shortly thereafter she was arrested for witchcraft. From what I can gather, we know this because there was a piece of correspondence from the mayor in 1647, which can now be found in the Clarendon Manuscript Archive. This document seems to confirm that Anne was held in a gaol, which is a place of confinement, or a jail basically, I suppose. An odd snippet states that despite being deprived of food for a period of time, her health didn't deteriorate very much, which you might think was a good thing, but I can't imagine that helped her witchcraft case very much. Anne stated that she was visited by the fair while she was being held in the gaol and that they would feed her an unusual bread. Anne was later released, though I'm not sure what the reason or circumstances were behind the release. But she went on to marry a labourer called William Warren and became involved in nursing. She said that she didn't know how, but that the fair had given her great knowledge about health, and she said that she wanted to use this to cure the ailments of others. In 1693, M. Pitt, who had somewhat maintained his friendship with Anne, took great interest in what had happened to her those years prior. He brought a friend of his, Humphrey Martin, who I think was a scholarly type back then, to interview her. but she wasn't interested. Humphrey wrote to M. Pitt, "As for Anne Jeffreys, I have been with her for the greater part of one day, and did read to her all that you have wrote to me, but she would not own anything of it, as concerning the fairies or any of the cures that she would perform. I asked her the reason why she would not do it. She replied that if she should discover it to you, that you would make books and ballads of it, and she said that she would not have her name spread about the country in books and ballads of such things." Which was probably a good idea if she didn't want to be on trial for witchcraft again. Of course, it's difficult to know what to make of all that, given it was such a long time ago, but the belief in the fae was widespread at that time, and there were other reported incidents similar to Anne's. In fact, it was so widespread that King James, who reigned between 1603 and 1625, 1 year before Anne's birth, took a particular interest in the fae. It's not clear what happened or why he became so interested in them, but he believed they were something wholly malevolent and to be avoided at all cost. Of course, in Anne's instance, these hidden people taking her into a castle in the sky makes me think of something else. Something perhaps more similar to the incident relayed by Calvin and Charlie. The Native Americans weren't free of the hidden people either, and you can find mention of them in various tribes. In the Crow tribe's folklore, the Little People were said to have lived in the Pryor Mountain located in Montana. The Crows would make offerings to the Little People in order to appease them. These Little People were known among the tribe for stealing their children and taking their food. Similarly, the Eskasoni tribe in Canada spoke of Little People who lived in a hill in Nova Scotia. The tribe believed that these little folk would take their young ones and warn their kids not to venture too far away from the group. Generally speaking, the Native Americans were fearful of the Little People for the most part because of their unpredictability. The Cherokee people spoke of Little People who would steal things from them and would trick them while fishing. However, they also spoke of encounters similar to the others, that being their young ones vanishing without a trace. The Cherokee also sometimes referred to the hidden people as the Nunahai and the Yunwi Sundi. According to their lore, the Nunahai lived inside an invisible realm next to humans, which again does sound a lot like the concept of being hidden in plain sight. There are also accounts of tribesmen and women disappearing, and in some of these instances they would blame the Little People for taking them to the invisible realm when trackers would come back empty-handed. There's one legend that I remember well involving Native Americans which resides on Mount Shasta. Early natives would complain of their people, specifically hunting and exploration parties going missing on or around the mountain, and they said that the area was cursed. They would speak of a big stone that would travel the mountain and swallow people whole. Of course, it's not clear what actual events took place that caused them to say this, but there are those today that still maintain the belief that the area is cursed and that it's best to stay away. Moving back closer to the present day, the idea of the fae or hidden people are still around. In 2007, the University of Iceland conducted a study and estimated that approximately 62% of Icelanders believe that the existence of the fae is more than just a piece of folklore. Iceland is a country that is riddled with stories of encounters with these small people, seemingly more so than any other place I know of. These encounters and beliefs hold some actual consequences too. In 2013, the Icelandic government wanted to construct a new road that would pass through a lava field, but the locals were not happy about this at all. There were constant protests because locals believed that the fae lived inside the large rocks in the area, and they believed that destroying their homes would be a grave mistake. One large boulder came up repeatedly in this conversation, which many locals, oddly, reported that they had seen Little People all over and around it. They believed that this particular boulder held some kind of deeper meaning to the hidden people. When the bulldozers would show up, there would be hundreds of protesters blocking the path, not allowing them to disturb the boulder. A local lady, who many of the locals believed served as sort of a contact between the hidden people and the community, said that the fae wouldn't retaliate as long as that boulder was carefully moved and placed elsewhere. There was a similar situation sometime in the 1970s when construction efforts wanted to be undertaken. A leader of this construction team later said that this experience made him believe that the fae were real. Their job was to move a massive boulder out of the way of a major road in Iceland. However, the construction workers reported being plagued by freakish accidents of which they'd never experienced before. They said that this job, in theory, wasn't even a complicated one, but immediately their bulldozer crushed a water pipe feeding a fish farm and over 70,000 trout perished. They said that many freakish events like this happened while trying to remove the boulder, and eventually they abandoned the project, feeling some of the force was at work. One of the workers believes even today that bad luck still follows him because of his involvement in the project. Bryndis, who is a writer and folklorist and teaches at the Iceland Academy of Arts, said, "There are many stories of machines breaking down and workers becoming ill when they interfere with rocks belonging to them. The fae are seen as friendly, beautiful creatures, but you have to respect them or they will take their revenge." Here's an interesting incident that I've paraphrased and quoted that was reported by irishcentral.com. This story was reported to the press by a man called Danny, who believes, and his family believes, that he was lured away from a picnic site by something unusual during his childhood. Danny said that at the time he was around 6 years old and doesn't remember all of the details, but his father and other family members present that day retold the events to him. In the late 90s, Danny and his family were on a picnic together at a rather large park. This park was also somewhat rural in the sense that it wasn't in the town but wasn't too far away either. The park itself had lots of forestry and vegetation, as well as many bodies of green-tinged water. Danny said that there were a small number of other families present, but not many, and they were all doing their own thing. At some point during the picnic, Danny said that he'd wandered off to play and his family weren't paying attention to him at the time until they'd realised that he wasn't around. Despite that, they weren't worried initially, but after his father began to walk around the grounds and couldn't find him, he felt uneasy as he just couldn't see him anywhere. It seems that the father assumed that Danny might have been playing with the other kids at the park, but he wasn't among any of them. He walked around and round without finding me. Apparently, he was starting to get a little worried, yet he was sure I was still there somewhere. He told me he thought that I was hiding from him. He walked to the edge of one of the ponds and listened to hear if he could find me. While he listened, he looked down at the water and noticed an odd bright green plant a short distance under the water. For a reason he can't explain, he got down to his knees, reached into the water and grasped the bright green plant. He pulled the plant out of the water, and as it started to emerge, he realised that it wasn't a plant, it was my hair. He lifted me into the air and I just looked at him calmly. Then he put me on the grass and I sat down peacefully. He stared at me in shock and asked me what happened. I told him that I was playing with some of the children. They told me to follow them to the water and I was playing with them there under the water. The only problem was that Danny was completely alone in the water and there was no one else nearby. I would very much like to hear your thoughts on all of the stories discussed throughout the video, so please do let me know what you thought in the comments below. I'd also love to hear of some topics that you'd like to see turned into a video like this. Your suggestions are very much welcomed. With that, I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you'd like to become a patron to support the channel and have your name ring around too, then please do visit the link in the description below. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like and a comment, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already. These things help me an awful lot. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm happy to hear your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.